The quiet storm. Serena Jackson was no stranger to the clouds that hung over her life, the subtle and often not so subtle storms of judgment, envy, and unspoken animosity. But today, as she stepped onto the plane, she welcomed the soft hum of the jet engines and the sterile calm of the cabin. It was a moment of peace, an oasis amid the whirlwinds of her life. Dressed in a sleek black dress that hinted at elegance without being flashy, and a tailored coat draped carefully over her arm, Serena exuded quiet grace, a quiet strength that had taken years to cultivate. The first-class cabin was as luxurious as she had come to expect. Comfortable, serene, almost too perfect. Rows of leather seats gleamed under the dimmed lighting, soft and inviting, a cocoon of wealth and comfort. Serena had earned her place in this world, not by playing by the rules, but by rewriting them. Jackson Enterprises, the multi-billion-dollar business she had built from the ground up, was a testament to her perseverance, vision, and unwavering belief in herself. But for all the success, the accolades, and the admiration of some, there was still something invisible, that lingered in the air whenever she entered a room. Serena had spent much of her life learning to live with it. The looks, the sideways glances, the whispers in the corners. She wasn't just a successful woman. She was a black woman who had broken barriers, disrupted industries, and forced her way into spaces where she was often unwelcome. And that made her both a symbol of inspiration and, to some, a reminder of their own insecurities. As she walked down the aisle, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor, she felt the familiar weight of the world watching her. She could sense the eyes that followed her, lingering a bit too long, the curiosity laced with judgment. But Serena had learned not to let it bother her, at least not on the surface. She had learned to keep her composure, to wear her confidence like armor, to rise above the noise and the prejudice. Her eyes swept over the cabin as she made her way to her seat. She paused for a brief moment, taking in the stillness around her. These rare moments of quiet were a luxury in her life, where every second was often consumed by the relentless demands of her business empire, by high-stakes decisions, and the pressure to maintain the success she had built. Serena allowed herself a single silent breath. It was fleeting, but in that moment, she felt the calm before the storm. She needed it, even if it was only for a moment. When she reached her seat, Serena placed her bag in the overhead compartment with deliberate precision. The soft lavender scent of the blanket beside her, the plushness of the seat, all promised a rare opportunity for rest. But Serena knew it wouldn't last. As soon as she arrived at her destination, the whirlwind would begin again. More meetings, more negotiations, more decisions that would test her leadership, her ability to maintain control in a world that seemed to want to take it from her at every turn. The plane began to taxi toward the runway, and Serena closed her eyes, allowing the rhythmic pulse of the jet engines to soothe her. She thought about the upcoming challenges, about the power struggles and the constant fight for recognition in a world that often overlooked her. She thought about the legacy she was creating for herself and the future she was building for the next generation of black women in business. But as the plane prepared to take off, a sudden shift in the atmosphere jolted her from her thoughts. There was tension in the air now, a growing unease that Serena couldn't quite place. It wasn't overt, but it was there, like an invisible weight pressing down on the cabin. Her eyes flicked toward the front of the plane, where the crew had gathered. The flight attendants were speaking in hushed tones, their faces a mix of professionalism and something else, something Serena had learned to recognize. There was a confrontation unfolding, the sharp tone of a man's voice cutting through the otherwise serene atmosphere of the flight. At first, it seemed like a minor dispute, but Serena could sense that it was more than that. She had lived long enough in a world that dealt with power, race, and privilege to recognize the signs of a situation about to escalate. The man's voice was laced with entitlement and frustration, his words clipped and harsh. It wasn't a conversation. It was a confrontation, one that had clearly crossed the line. Serena's instincts kicked in. She had dealt with people like him before, men who thought their position, their title, gave them the right to act with impunity, to disregard others as though they were beneath them. She had seen it too many times in her own life, especially in her career, where being a black woman in a space dominated by white men meant facing judgment, microaggressions, and outright discrimination at every turn. But this wasn't just about Serena. This was about something deeper, something personal for the man causing the disturbance. As the argument continued to escalate, the name tag on the flight attendant caught Serena's eye. Bethany. She had seen the brief flicker of hesitation in Bethany's eyes earlier when Serena had boarded the plane. The woman's smile had faltered for just a second, a barely perceptible moment that spoke volumes. It wasn't hostility, at least not outright hostility. But there was something else there, a discomfort that Serena couldn't shake. The truth was, Serena was no stranger to subtle biases, to people who saw her as an anomaly in a world that often reserved its most prestigious seats for people who looked like Captain Ellis, the man at the heart of the argument. As she settled into her seat, trying to ignore the rising tension, Serena couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. She didn't know what it would be yet, but she could feel it, like the first crack of thunder before a storm. And little did she know that this flight would be the setting for a confrontation that would not only challenge her resilience, but also force Captain Ellis to confront his own deep-seated prejudices. The cabin remained quiet for a while after the argument faded, but the uneasy undercurrent still hung thick in the air. Serena closed her eyes again, trying to shut out the growing tension. She had been through enough to know that this wasn't just a one-off incident. This was something much bigger, something that would test her ability to navigate the complexities of power and privilege. She didn't know it yet, but the confrontation that had just begun would change everything for both her and the man who seemed determined to undermine her presence. As the plane ascended into the sky, Serena's thoughts drifted back to the man who had caused the disturbance, Captain Martin Ellis. She could feel the simmering resentment in his actions, even though she hadn't heard the specifics of the argument. Serena knew it was coming. The storm was brewing, and she was about to become its epicenter. But she had been through storms before, and no matter how violent the winds, she would not be moved. Captain Ellis, on the other hand, was about to learn that the presence of a strong black woman in a space he thought was his alone would force him to confront a reality he had long avoided, and neither of them would walk away from this flight unchanged. A silent tension. The plane hummed steadily in the air, its engines thrumming a constant rhythm that would have calmed most passengers. But for Serena Jackson, the steady hum only amplified the strange sense of unease that had settled in the pit of her stomach. The flight had reached cruising altitude, and the soft voice of the captain had echoed through the intercom, offering the usual words of reassurance. "We're cruising now. Enjoy your flight." But Serena couldn't enjoy the flight. Not yet. Not with the storm she felt building just beneath the surface. She closed her eyes for a moment, exhaling slowly. She needed to focus, to center herself. She had grown accustomed to dealing with the discomfort of being the only woman of color in rooms full of white men, of being the target of sideways glances, whispered judgments, and the occasional condescending tone. It was a part of life she had learned to navigate, like a second skin that, while uncomfortable, had become a part of her. But this felt different. Her eyes drifted open, scanning the cabin as she shifted in her seat. Most of the passengers were settled into their own worlds, some sleeping, others engrossed in their books or screens. The calm facade of the first-class cabin, with its muted lighting and plush sheets, had once seemed like a sanctuary, a space where she could retreat from the pressures of her empire. But now it felt stifling. There was something in the air, a crackling tension that refused to be ignored. At the front of the cabin, Serena noticed Captain Martin Ellis again. He was standing near the galley, speaking with one of the flight attendants, a woman with short, dark hair who had been polite but distant when she greeted Serena earlier. Bethany, the flight attendant, was leaning in toward Ellis, her voice low and measured. Serena couldn't hear the exact words, but she could tell the conversation was not a casual one. There was an edge to their interaction, a quiet intensity that echoed the underlying tension in the cabin. Serena knew better than to get involved. She had learned long ago to pick her battles, to wait for the right moment to speak up. She wasn't here to fight. She was here to get to her destination, to make decisions that would shape her company's future. But as she watched Ellis's face redden, his jaw tighten with barely concealed anger, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to snap. His agitation was palpable, and it felt all too familiar. She had seen men like him before, their egos bruised, their sense of entitlement threatening to boil over. But this wasn't just a disagreement over seating or service. Serena could feel it. This was personal. Her thoughts drifted to her own experiences, to the countless moments when she had been forced to prove herself simply because of the color of her skin or the fact that she was a woman in a male-dominated field. She had always been the exception, never the rule. And while she had grown thick skin over the years, there were still moments, like now, when the weight of being constantly judged, scrutinized, and underestimated hit harder than usual. But Serena was no stranger to discomfort. She had faced it all her life. In boardrooms where her voice was often drowned out by louder, more familiar voices. In social settings where people looked at her as though she didn't belong. In corporate spaces where her very presence challenged the status quo. Serena had always risen above, always pushed forward, always used the power of her own resolve to shatter the barriers that others tried to place around her. And yet, as the plane cut through the sky, she couldn't escape the nagging feeling that today, in this moment, she was not just fighting for space. She was fighting for something deeper, something more profound. Her gaze shifted back to Captain Ellis. He was now pacing near the cockpit, his hands clenched tightly at his sides. There was a fire in his eyes, a smoldering rage that Serena couldn't ignore. The pilot had been glaring at her during the earlier moments of the flight. She realized, his eyes narrowing with something akin to disdain when she had walked past him earlier, her quiet confidence seemingly too much for him to handle. Serena had felt it then. The subtle discomfort, the judgment, the undercurrent of something that had nothing to do with professionalism and everything to do with his biases. Serena had been here before, too. She had faced the looks, the sideways glances, the whispered judgments from people who couldn't understand how she had achieved her success. She had learned to rise above it, to wear her confidence like armor. But there was something about Ellis that unsettled her. Perhaps it was the way he held himself, so assured, so convinced of his place in the world, so unwilling to accept anyone who didn't fit his narrow view of who belonged in the elite circles he occupied. Serena could see it now, in the way he looked at her, as if she were an anomaly, as if she were a problem to be solved. She leaned back in her seat, trying to quiet the thoughts swirling in her mind. This wasn't her battle. Not today. She had come on this flight for one reason, to get to her next meeting, to continue building her legacy. But the tension in the air was impossible to ignore. It wasn't just about Captain Ellis's animosity. It was the way his discomfort had infected the entire cabin, the way people around her now acted as though they, too, felt a subtle but unmistakable shift in the atmosphere. It was as if they could sense what was happening. The clash of two worlds, two realities, two visions of what was possible. Serena's hand tightened around the armrest, her pulse quickening slightly. She had been through moments like this before, moments when her very presence in a space had forced people to confront their own biases, their own prejudices. She had been underestimated, dismissed, and written off countless times in her life. But she had also learned to navigate those moments, to use them as fuel, to transform the weight of discrimination into the momentum she needed to propel herself forward. This time, though, it felt different. Captain Ellis wasn't just an obstacle to overcome. He was a reflection of something far more insidious, the way society had been conditioned to view people like her as exceptions, anomalies, threats to the order of things. The fact that Serena had risen to the top, had become a billionaire in a world that so often excluded people like her, was something that would never sit well with men like Ellis. They could never understand how a woman who looked like her could belong in the places they had claimed as their own. And so, The storm raged within him, building with each passing minute, each strained conversation with the flight attendants, each dark look he cast in Serena's direction. She could feel it. She had learned long ago to recognize the signs of impending conflict, of a man on the verge of losing control, and Captain Ellis was teetering on that edge. As the flight progressed, Serena did her best to ignore the growing tension, to retreat into her thoughts, to distance herself from the simmering conflict that she knew was about to boil over. But she couldn't shake the feeling that this was different. This wasn't just about Captain Ellis. This wasn't just another random encounter with prejudice. This was personal. And Serena was about to learn just how deep those prejudices ran. The breaking point. The plane soared through the sky. The landscape below nothing but a blur of clouds and distant horizons. Yet inside the cabin, it felt as though time had slowed. The gentle hum of the engines no longer offered comfort to Serena. Instead, it echoed the growing dissonance between herself and Captain Ellis, a discordant note that resonated in every moment of tension that rippled through the plane. The feeling of discomfort had settled in so deeply that it was now impossible to ignore, and Serena knew that things were about to change. As the flight continued, she couldn't help but feel the air around her grow thicker. It wasn't just the physical discomfort of being confined in a small space with a crew and passengers who were all unwittingly caught up in the brewing storm. It was a much deeper sense of unease, an invisible pressure that had crept into the cabin and clung to the walls, like a shadow waiting to reveal itself. Captain Ellis had stopped pacing near the cockpit. For the past hour, Serena had watched him from her seat, his agitation shifting between nervous tension and outward hostility. He had been brief and curt with the flight attendants, his words clipped and dismissive whenever they tried to engage him. Bethany, the young flight attendant, had become more reserved as the flight progressed, her smile faltering every time she passed by Serena. And the sense of unease she carried seemed to be feeding off of Ellis's mood. Serena was no stranger to the power dynamics at play. She had worked with some of the most influential people in the world, men and women who had often tried to dismiss her, belittle her, or undermine her achievements. But Captain Ellis was different. There was a sharpness to his animosity that made Serena's skin prickle. It wasn't just the fact that he looked at her with disdain. It was the way he tried to make her feel small, the way his gaze lingered on her, as though she were an intruder in his world. She could sense his discomfort whenever their eyes met, an unease that came from more than just her being in the first-class cabin. It was a discomfort born of something deeper, something Serena couldn't immediately define. As the minutes passed, Serena leaned back in her seat, her eyes drifting from the window to the front of the cabin. The conversation between Captain Ellis and his co-pilot, Thomas, was low enough that she couldn't make out the words, but she could hear the tension in the tone. It was clear that Ellis was still struggling to regain his composure, to steady his mind, but it was equally clear that something was unraveling inside him. Serena's instincts told her that the situation would escalate soon, and she wasn't wrong. The calm exterior of the flight attendants slowly began to crack. One by one, they passed Serena, their faces painted with the same professional mask, but it was no longer convincing. They were uneasy, their movements more clipped, their smiles less sincere. The usual politeness had begun to feel forced, like an attempt to maintain order in the face of something unpredictable. At that moment, the plane hit a slight turbulence, the kind that makes you feel as though the entire world around you has shifted, even if only for a second. Serena's body tensed as the plane dipped and then leveled out, the seatbelt sign flickering back on. For a brief moment, the unsettling atmosphere in the cabin seemed to dissipate, as though the turbulence had jolted everyone back into the present. But the storm that had been quietly gathering within Ellis was far from over. Serena's eyes returned to the cockpit. She saw the way Ellis's face contorted with frustration, his hands gripping the armrest of his seat as though he were trying to hold on to something that was slipping through his fingers. His frustration was palpable, and it was starting to leak out into every interaction he had. The calm professionalism that had once been his shield had been replaced with something raw, something dangerous. Serena knew better than to ignore the signs. He was on the verge of losing control. When the captain's voice suddenly crackled over the intercom again, it was enough to make Serena's body stiffen. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking," he began, his voice devoid of the usual calm authority. "We will be experiencing some minor turbulence. Please remain seated and keep your seatbelts fastened." The voice that followed was nothing like the reassuring tone he had used earlier. It was harsh, clipped, almost as though he were addressing the passengers with a level of irritation he couldn't hide. Serena's eyes narrowed, and she immediately knew that the frustration Ellis felt wasn't just about the turbulence. It was personal. His ego had been bruised the moment he had seen her enter the plane. As the plane continued its journey, the tension between Ellis and the flight attendants intensified. He was becoming more agitated, his brief exchanges with the crew colder and more dismissive. The cracks in his professionalism were starting to show, and it wasn't long before the situation reached its breaking point. Serena could hear the low hum of conversations around her, passengers speaking in hushed tones, their eyes shifting between one another as though waiting for something to happen. No one spoke directly to her, but she could feel the stares, the lingering glances that seemed to ask the same question. What would happen now? And then it happened. Serena had been lost in thought, her gaze fixed on the window, when she felt it. A sudden, sharp shift in the atmosphere. The sound of raised voices broke through the stillness, and she turned to see the flight attendants gathered at the front of the cabin, their expressions tense. In the midst of their conversation stood Captain Ellis, his face flushed with anger, his body rigid with a barely contained fury. "What's going on?" Serena asked, her voice calm but steady, as she caught the eye of one of the attendants who had been closest to the confrontation. Bethany hesitated for a moment, her eyes flickering to the front of the plane, where Ellis was still arguing with one of the senior flight attendants. The conversation was heated, and though Serena couldn't hear the specifics, the tension was palpable. "I'm sorry, man, it's just, there's been an issue with the captain," Bethany finally replied, her voice low. She avoided making eye contact, her body language stiff. Serena's heart skipped a beat. She didn't need to be told the details to understand what was going on. It was clear that Captain Ellis's anger was no longer just a quiet undercurrent. It had erupted, and the rest of the cabin was feeling the heat of it. The flight attendants were trying to calm him down, to de-escalate the situation, but it was evident that their efforts weren't working. Ellis's temper had flared, and Serena knew that his issues weren't just with the crew. They were with her. The moment she had boarded the plane, she had become a target for his anger, an embodiment of everything he resented and couldn't control. Serena felt a cold rush of determination wash over her. She wasn't going to let him make her a victim in this situation. She had worked too hard, fought too long, to let a man like Ellis define her experience. She stood up slowly, her movements deliberate, and walked down the aisle toward the front of the cabin. Her heart was pounding, but her face remained impassive, the mask of composure she had perfected slipping into place. As she neared the front, she saw Captain Ellis standing by the galley, his fists clenched at his sides, his face twisted in rage. The crew was trying to speak to him, but he wasn't listening. Serena's presence seemed to agitate him further, his eyes narrowing as she approached. "Captain Ellis," Serena said calmly, her voice even and strong, cutting through the tension like a knife. He turned to her, his face flushed, his jaw tightening as he fought to keep his anger in check. But Serena could see it. He was unraveling, his grip on control slipping. "What's the problem, Captain?" she asked, her gaze steady. Ellis opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. For a moment, it was as if he didn't know how to respond. He was a man who had spent his life in control, a man who had never been forced to confront the things that had been buried deep inside him. But now, here she was, a woman who, in his eyes, didn't belong in the space he had claimed as his own. Serena didn't wait for him to answer. Instead, she looked him directly in the eyes and spoke with quiet authority. "If there's an issue, I suggest you address it. But you will not speak to me or anyone else in this manner." For a long moment, Ellis stood there, his eyes flashing with a mixture of disbelief and anger. But Serena stood firm, unyielding, her presence in the room like a force of nature. The cabin had grown quiet, the atmosphere heavy with anticipation, and it was clear that the moment had arrived. Unspoken realities. The tension in the cabin was so thick that Serena could almost taste it. The murmurs among the passengers had quieted to an uneasy stillness, each individual holding their breath, unsure of what would come next. Serena could feel every eye on her, but she didn't flinch. The way the passengers were looking at her wasn't new. It was the same type of gaze she had encountered countless times before, a mixture of disbelief, curiosity, and perhaps most unnervingly, judgment. But she wouldn't let it affect her. Not now. Not when the storm was just beginning. Captain Ellis stood just a few feet away, his face flushed, his posture rigid. The encounter in the galley had felt like a crack in the dam, a slow, creeping crack that threatened to break open everything beneath the surface. And as Serena stared him down, she could see that the storm was in full force within him now. His eyes, usually so controlled, were wild, betraying the chaos beneath. He was no longer the calm professional, the pilot who had announced their safe ascent with smooth precision. Now, he was a man unraveling before her eyes, and the truth of his internal struggle was clear. He was losing the battle against his own biases. "I don't know who you think you are." Ellis's voice broke through the heavy silence, sharp and full of accusation. His words hung in the air, thick and venomous. "But you don't belong here. You're not one of us." Serena's heart didn't race. Her pulse remained steady, her expression unreadable. She had seen men like him before, those who clung desperately to their outdated ideals, their sense of superiority eroding with every passing second. He had tried to diminish her with a single glance, with every moment of hostility that had slipped from his lips, but she wouldn't allow it. Not today. "No," Serena said, her voice calm and even, cutting through the fog of his frustration. "I'm exactly where I belong. I've earned my place, just like everyone else on this flight." The words came out with such quiet conviction that it almost stunned Ellis into silence. He blinked, and for a moment, Serena saw the flicker of doubt cross his face. The briefest hesitation, as if the reality of the situation was beginning to crack through the armor of his arrogance. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced once again by the scorn and contempt he had worn like a mask for so long. "You don't understand." Ellis spat, the words thick with a mix of fear and anger. "You think you can walk into a space like this and just be one of them. You think that your money, your success, whatever it is, can make you equal to the rest of us." Serena's gaze softened, not with pity, but with understanding. She knew what was happening now, what had been happening from the very first moment she had set foot on the plane. This wasn't just about a flight dispute. This wasn't about service, professionalism, or rules. This was about his worldview, the fragile construct that had kept him comfortable in a life where people like her were meant to remain at the edges, where the rich, white men like him had always been the ones to dictate who belonged in what spaces. She was a direct threat to everything he had ever been told about his place in the world. "Captain Ellis," Serena began, her voice still steady, "this isn't about who you think I am. It's about the fact that I'm here. It's about the fact that I've overcome the same systems you've grown comfortable in. Systems that told me I shouldn't be here, shouldn't be a CEO, shouldn't be a billionaire, because of my race, my gender, my identity. And yet, here I am." Ellis sneered, but his fists clenched at his sides, his breathing ragged. His mouth opened as though to retort, but Serena pressed on, unwilling to let him deflect or shut her down. "I didn't come into this space looking to make anyone uncomfortable," she continued, "but you've made it clear that my very presence here is too much for you to bear. What I've learned in life, Captain, is that your discomfort is not my problem. It's a reflection of everything you haven't been able to face. And it's about time you did. The words hung in the air, heavy and final. The entire cabin seemed to hold its breath as the seconds ticked by. For a moment, there was nothing but silence, the kind that comes when truth has been spoken, and the world feels as though it's paused, waiting for the next move. And then, finally, Captain Ellis's shoulders slumped slightly, as though the weight of Serena's words had landed with more force than he could handle. His jaw clenched, and for the first time, Serena saw a flicker of vulnerability in his eyes. The rage was still there, but it was overshadowed by something else, a deeper, quieter turmoil that he had never had to confront until now. Serena wasn't expecting an apology. She wasn't even expecting him to acknowledge what he had done, what had driven him to lash out. But what she did expect was that this moment, this confrontation, would force him to face the ugly truth about himself. The truth that he had lived a life insulated from the realities of the world for people like Serena, for people who didn't fit the mold he had been so comfortable in. But she didn't want to just defeat him in a battle of words. She didn't want him to feel like he had lost. What Serena wanted, what she needed, was for him to recognize the full extent of his biases, to see the limitations in his worldview, to make him understand that no one, not even him, was beyond change. "You don't have to like me, Captain," Serena said, her voice softening, "but you will respect me. And the people who are here because they belong here, not because they're granted permission to exist in these spaces. This plane, this company, this world, it doesn't belong to just one type of person. It's bigger than that. And it's time for you to see that." For a long, tense moment, Ellis said nothing. He stood there, his eyes meeting hers, and Serena knew that, deep down, he was struggling. His pride, his sense of power, was cracking under the weight of her words. Serena stood still, not backing down, not flinching. She had nothing more to prove. She had built her life and her success from nothing, fought against every barrier, and still emerged standing tall. She had nothing to be ashamed of. "I suggest," Serena said finally, her voice sharp, "that you take some time to think about what just happened. And the next time you want to judge someone based on what you think they should be, take a good long look at your reflection." Captain Ellis remained silent as she turned to walk back to her seat, the weight of their confrontation still hanging in the air. He didn't stop her, didn't speak, didn't try to interject. It was clear that something in him had shifted, something in his worldview had cracked, even if it was only the smallest of fractures. As Serena returned to her seat, she felt the eyes of the other passengers on her, some curious, some wide-eyed, some uncertain. But there was no longer any question in her mind about who she was. She wasn't here for their approval. She wasn't here to prove herself to anyone. What she had done in that moment wasn't just stand up for herself. It was to stand up for every person who had ever been overlooked, underestimated, or dismissed simply because they didn't fit the narrow view of what society deemed acceptable. She wasn't a token, a symbol, or an anomaly. She was Serena Jackson, and she had earned her place in this world. The rest of the flight passed in a charged silence, but the storm that had once threatened to consume the cabin had begun to settle. Serena had won this battle, not with anger, but with the quiet strength she had cultivated throughout her life. And for Captain Ellis, the real battle had just begun. He had been forced to confront his own biases, and the realization that he was no longer in control would linger with him long after the flight was over. Shattered illusions. The tension in the cabin never fully dissipated, but the storm had passed. Serena could feel the heavy silence settle in around her, suffocating and thick, but there was also a strange sense of calm that followed the confrontation. She could still feel the weight of Captain Ellis's gaze, even from the distance between them. His presence, once commanding and assured, had now become somewhat smaller, less certain, as though the very foundation of his beliefs had been shaken. But Serena knew better than to expect a sudden change. People like him didn't evolve in a moment. It took time, reflection, and the willingness to confront deeply ingrained biases. As she settled back into her seat, Serena's thoughts were clouded with the events that had just transpired. She wasn't looking for validation. She never had been. But in a way, this moment had felt like a small victory. A victory not just for herself, but for everyone who had been marginalized, belittled, or ignored because of their identity. She had confronted Captain Ellis not with anger, but with quiet strength, not with force, but with the undeniable truth of her existence. The truth that she belonged. Her fingers tapped absently on the armrest as she glanced toward the front of the cabin. Ellis had retreated into the cockpit, and the flight attendants had gone back to their duties. But Serena knew that what had happened in those few moments of confrontation had cracked something wide open. The delicate veil of professionalism that had shielded Ellis from his own truth was no longer intact. She didn't know what would happen after the flight, but she knew that the man who had once looked at her with disdain would never view her, or anyone else who challenged his worldview, the same way again. The remainder of the flight continued in relative quiet, though it was far from peaceful. Serena could feel the eyes of the other passengers flicker toward her every so often, but none dared approach. No one spoke to her. No one acknowledged what had just transpired. There was no applause, no overt recognition of the small stand she had taken, and in many ways, Serena was okay with that. She wasn't here to garner applause. She had fought this battle for herself, for her dignity, not for the approval of anyone else. Yet, as the plane neared its destination, a shift began to unfold. It wasn't the dramatic climax of a confrontation, but rather the quiet, subtle power of change. Slow, deliberate, and deeply personal. The man who had stood at the front of the plane, angry and arrogant, now seemed diminished, almost fragile. Serena had never believed in the idea that someone could be broken by confrontation. Rather, it was the moment that exposed them for who they truly were, forcing them to face the parts of themselves they had spent their lives hiding. And for Ellis, this flight had exposed the raw truth of his biases, the lies he had told himself, and the deeply ingrained prejudices that had shaped his life in ways he couldn't yet understand. Serena looked out of the window at the sprawling city below. Her thoughts drifted to her company, to the battles she fought every day, to the women who had reached out to her over the years, thanking her for setting an example. She had become more than just a businesswoman in their eyes. She had become a symbol of defiance, of perseverance, of a reminder that no one, not even a system built on exclusion, could stop a determined woman from achieving her dreams. The journey had never been easy, and it never would be. But she had always known that the road to success would require more than just hard work and intelligence. It would require the courage to challenge the norms, to confront injustice, and to stand tall in the face of adversity. As the plane began its descent, the seatbelt sign flickered on once again. Serena's eyes briefly closed as she felt the plane tilt gently, the turbulence of the past hours now nothing more than a faint memory. Her mind shifted back to Captain Ellis. She didn't feel anger anymore, nor frustration. There was only a quiet sadness that lingered in the pit of her stomach. She felt sorry for him, in a way. For all his power, for all his control, he had spent his life in a prison of his own making. He had lived in a world where people like Serena weren't allowed to exist, and when she shattered that illusion, he had been forced to reckon with everything he had believed to be true. The realization had to be painful. But in the end, it was a lesson that needed to be learned. If Ellis was ever going to grow, he would need to understand the complexity of his own prejudice and the limitations of the world he had created in his mind. The world where people like Serena were not allowed to occupy space. The world where his narrow view of success had only room for those who fit his mold. But what Ellis hadn't realized, what many people like him never realized, is that the world had already moved on. The walls they had built to keep others out were crumbling, and the more they resisted, the more they would find themselves left behind. As the plane touched down, Serena felt the familiar rush of anticipation. She had arrived at her destination, but she knew that the real journey for both her and Ellis had just begun. This flight would be one that neither of them would forget. For her, It would be a reminder that she was not only capable of surviving in a world that often tried to make her feel less than, but that she was also strong enough to confront the barriers that stood in her way, even when they came from places she never expected. And for Captain Ellis, it would be the beginning of a long, hard journey towards self-reflection, a journey that would force him to reckon with his own biases and question the very foundation of his beliefs. What he hadn't realized was that Serena's quiet strength wasn't just a challenge to his authority. It was an opportunity for him to change. It was an invitation to tear down the walls he had built around himself and step into a world where true equality was possible. The plane came to a halt, the engines whirring down as the cabin lights flickered on. Serena stood, her posture dignified, her gaze steady as she made her way toward the exit. As she passed through the cabin, she couldn't help but notice the way the other passengers looked at her, differently now. There was a subtle shift, something unspoken, something that told her that they had witnessed something powerful, something real. The doors of the plane opened, and Serena stepped into the jet bridge, her heels clicking against the floor with quiet purpose. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. The storm had passed. The world was about to change, one small moment at a time. The long road ahead. The moment Serena stepped off the plane, the world felt different. The rush of cool air against her skin, the hum of activity in the terminal, the steady flow of passengers moving in every direction. It all seemed so ordinary, yet for some reason, it felt heavier now. She had just completed a long flight, but the journey ahead was far more significant. The confrontation with Captain Ellis had been just a small, singular event in her life, but the ripples it created felt profound, stretching out into the broader world in ways she could not yet fully understand. As she made her way through the terminal, her mind kept returning to the man she had left behind on the plane. Martin Ellis, the pilot who had tried to diminish her with nothing more than a look, a tone, a sneer. He hadn't been the first, nor would he be the last, but something about him had unsettled her. Not because of his arrogance or disdain, those were familiar traits in people who couldn't accept change, but because of the pain she had seen beneath his anger, the raw frustration he felt, the world crumbling beneath his feet, and the uncomfortable truths he had been forced to confront. Serena knew that she had done what she needed to do. She had stood her ground, made her voice heard, and confronted him with the reality he had spent so long avoiding. But the encounter had not been easy, and the battle was far from over. People like Ellis didn't change overnight. The journey for him had only just begun, and Serena understood that real transformation came slowly, with many painful lessons along the way. She wasn't naive enough to think that he would immediately embrace the change in his worldview, but she truly hoped, that he would begin to ask the right questions. Serena's phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a text from her assistant. "The board meeting starts in 30 minutes. I've got everything prepped. We'll be expecting your arrival shortly." She sighed, her pace quickening as she approached the exit. The weight of the day's events had settled on her shoulders like an invisible cloak, but her resolve remained unbroken. She had a job to do, a legacy to build, and the world would keep turning, whether she engaged with its challenges or not. But what had happened on the plane, what had happened with Captain Ellis, was something that she couldn't easily dismiss. It was a reminder that every day, in every interaction, the battle for equality, respect, and dignity was ongoing. And that was a fight Serena was ready to continue. As she stepped into the back of the car waiting for her, the familiar comfort of her routine began to settle in. She leaned back in the plush seat, closing her eyes for a moment, trying to center herself. The world was moving fast, and she was expected to keep up. The demands of her company, her employees, the investors, and the countless people who relied on her leadership never ceased. But beneath it all, she had to carry the knowledge that her presence, her very being, was a statement in and of itself. Serena Jackson was a black billionaire woman in a world that still struggled to understand her place. But more than that, she was a leader, a visionary who had fought her way to the top of a corporate empire. And every challenge she faced, every slight she encountered, only fueled her drive to keep pushing forward, to prove that no barrier could stand in her way. The flight, the confrontation with Ellis, had been a reminder that there were still forces in this world that sought to keep her from her rightful place, but she wouldn't let them win. Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, Martin Ellis sat alone in his apartment, staring out the window at the skyline. The weight of the flight still hung over him, an oppressive force that seemed to follow him even after he had landed. He had returned to his home, but there was no comfort there, only the quiet ticking of the clock and the unanswered questions that lingered in his mind. The conversation he had had with Serena was still fresh in his memory. Her calm demeanor, her quiet strength, it had all shaken him in ways he couldn't yet process. He had tried to dismiss her words, to brush them off as the righteous anger of someone who didn't understand. But deep down, he knew that what she had said had struck a chord with him. Her challenge to his worldview, her reminder that he was living in a society that was no longer the one he had been taught to believe in, had left him unsettled. The realization had come slowly, creeping into his mind during the final hours of the flight. What Serena had forced him to confront was not just his personal biases. It was the crumbling of an entire system, a structure that had worked to his benefit his entire life. The world he had known, the one where he could claim spaces and titles simply because of who he was beginning to erode. People like Serena, people who had broken through the barriers he had always relied on, were becoming a reality that couldn't be ignored. As the days passed, Martin tried to push the thoughts aside. He immersed himself in his work, throwing himself into the routine he had carefully constructed. But no matter how hard he tried, the nagging questions would not go away. He had always believed that success was something earned, that it was determined by the merit of a person's actions, their abilities, and their sacrifices. But what he had witnessed in Serena's calm confidence, in the quiet strength that radiated from her every movement, had made him wonder, was it really about merit, or was it about opportunity, about power? For the first time in his life, Ellis found himself questioning the foundations of his beliefs. It wasn't just about Serena anymore. It was about everything he had ever been taught, everything he had ever known. The following weeks would be difficult for him. He found himself unable to shake the memory of Serena's words, her unflinching gaze. He began to notice the biases in his own behavior, the subtle assumptions, the moments when he judged people based on what they looked like rather than who they were. He began to see the ways in which his position of power had shielded him from seeing the world in a different way. It wasn't easy. In fact, it was painful. The truths he was facing about himself were not easy to swallow. But the truth, once acknowledged, could never be denied. It gnawed at him, demanding that he do better, be better. And so, Martin began to make small changes, small, incremental steps toward becoming more aware of his own prejudices. He started reading, engaging in conversations that had once made him uncomfortable. He listened more intently to the experiences of those who had lived through the very biases he had ignored for so long. And through it all, he thought about Serena, about her resilience, about her strength. He didn't know if he could ever fully understand the weight of what she carried every day, but he knew that his perspective had been irrevocably changed. He didn't know what the future would hold, but for the first time in a long while, he felt a glimmer of hope, a belief that perhaps it wasn't too late to change. As for Serena, the challenges she faced were far from over. She knew that one encounter, no matter how significant, would not change the world overnight. There were still battles to be fought, prejudices to be broken, and walls to be torn down. But she also knew that every moment, every encounter, every victory was part of the larger struggle. And as long as she was breathing, she would keep fighting. The world might not change as quickly as she wanted it to, but with every step she took, with every challenge she overcame, Serena was one step closer to the future she envisioned, a future where everyone, no matter their race or background, could truly have an equal place at the table.